Greetings and welcome to the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. My name is Peter Mandeville and I'm Senior Research Fellow here at the Center. At Georgetown, I lead the Center's Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, a multi-year research initiative enabled by generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, dedicated to exploring and understanding the various ways that religion fits into the foreign policy and external relations of states and governments around the world. Today's program is part of this project, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Our panel today, which is co-sponsored by Georgetown University's Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, will be exploring religious soft power in Russian foreign policy, constitutional change, and the Russian Orthodox Church. From the conflict in Ukraine to the transnationalization of culture wars, the Moscow Patriarchate has served as a steadfast soft power echo for Russian foreign policy interests during the Putin era. The Kremlin continues to deepen its reliance on the Russian Orthodox Church as a lever of soft power, and constitutional amendments ratified in July of last year suggest that this church-state partnership is poised to grow stronger and more entrenched in the coming years. To help us better understand these trends and their significance, we are delighted to welcome to the Berkeley Center Dr. Robert C. Blitt, a professor at the University of Tennessee's College of Law. The immediate pretext for our conversation with Professor Blitt is a new policy brief that he's authored as a contribution to the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, and which we published just last week. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read his full and very impressive biography, but rather, as our discussion gets started, I will place in the chat box a link to his online profile, as well as a link to that piece of his that we just published. I'll also include a link to the main landing page for the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, where you can learn more about the initiative and also access the wide range of articles, working papers, and video recordings of previous talks associated with the project. We're excited that in 2021 and 2022, the project will be publishing 2 edited volumes with Oxford University Press, one of which features a chapter by today's speaker. I'll also include a link and encourage you to visit the website of our partner for this event, the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. Before I hand things over to Professor Blitt to get our discussion started, just a few brief words about logistics and our format today. I wanted to first make sure that everyone is aware that today's session is being recorded for the benefit of those who are not able to join us for the live discussion. Everyone registered for the event will receive a link to that video once it becomes available. After Dr. Blitt's presentation, we will have some time available for a discussion, questions, and you can participate in that at any time during the session today by using the Q&A function at the on the main Zoom control panel, where you'll be able to type in your question. And after Dr. Blitt's remarks, I'll be putting a selection of those questions to him. So now, without further ado, let me turn things over to our featured speaker, Professor Robert C. Blitt. Rob, welcome, and thanks so much for being with us today.
Hey, Peter, thank you so much for that very gracious introduction. It is really a pleasure to be here. I know that our time is short, and so I will just get my slides set up and get started, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. All right, is that looking okay? Great. So again, thank you, Peter, for that introduction and inviting me to participate today in this really ambitious project on geopolitics of religious soft power. I have big shoes to fill, having participated in some of the previous presentations, and I'm really excited to have the chance to do that. I also want to say thanks to the Berkeley Center for hosting this event and publishing the policy brief that is the basis for this presentation. I want to start today with, I guess, an anecdote or a story, if you will. And it's a story about the Church of All Saints that's located in Strasbourg, France. The church was consecrated in 2019 at a cost of $16 million to build it. At the time that it was being constructed, the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate suggested that the donations were coming from private donors. The reality is a little bit different than that, and estimates say that up to 70% of the funding for the construction of the church was coming from state-owned enterprises like Transneft. And I'm just pulling up here an excerpt from Transneft's annual report, where you can see that among their accomplishments, they're boasting of the completion of the construction of the Church of All Saints in Strasbourg, France. In addition to the government sourced or government channeled funding of this construction project, the church itself is a helpful departure point because it tangibly embodies the ROC's inherently political role as a soft power echo for Kremlin foreign policy. The church is intentionally, strategically situated amidst the Strasbourg institutions like the Council of Europe and the EU Parliament in the diplomatic quarter, and it really seeks to showcase the outsized influence of Russian civilization. The size of the church itself dwarfs the local Orthodox compatriot community in Strasbourg, and as a compound, it serves as a launch pad for the church's political activities. So outside of the religious and spiritually motivated services that might be happening in the church itself, the Russian Orthodox Church maintains its official representation to COE institutions out of the compound, and also one of its NGO's activities, the Center for Monitoring Rights and Freedom of Orthodox Christians in Europe. So both of those groups undertaking the political activities that they do are based out of that compound. Patriarch Kirill actually traveled to Strasbourg to consecrate the church in 2019. And as part of his travel there, he took the time to meet with the COE's Secretary General and also with the COE's Commissioner for Human Rights. And what's really interesting to point out is that during those meetings, the focus wasn't on concerns relating to freedom of religion or belief as they might be unfolding in the various member states of the Council of Europe. Rather, the takeaway from Patriarch Kirill's meetings was the decidedly temporal concern around securing Russia's readmission to the COE following its suspension after the occupation of Crimea. So from my perspective, the anecdote really encapsulates the ROC's activity as a soft power conduit for Kremlin foreign policy interests, and it helps to set the stage for what we're going to talk about today, which is the impact and relevancy of the 2020 constitutional amendments on this burgeoning role for the church. When the amendments started at the beginning of January 2020, or the amendment process started at the beginning of 2020, the focus and media attention was really on domestic reforms and, of course, the decision to reset the presidential term limits for President Putin. But a closer look at the amendments really demonstrate that they harbor significant foreign policy implications. And those implications, in turn, signal this outsized role for the Russian Orthodox Church as one of the chief soft power advocates and echoes for Kremlin foreign policy. So the amendments that I want to focus on, basically for the remainder of the presentation, revolve around sovereignty and non-interference, the falsification of history, the protection of compatriot rights, and traditional values. And I'll turn to them now. So looking at the amendments relating to sovereignty and non-interference, the Russian Constitution now enables the rejection of international judicial decisions on the basis of the Constitution and foundations of public order. And the Constitution also calls for preventing interference in internal affairs of the state. These two things are plainly tied to the Kremlin's interest in creating an international arena of multipolarity within which Russia plays a primary role. And the way that role is played out is by advocating in favor of a very muscular version of sovereignty and non-interference. So for example, if we zeroed in on the European Court of Human Rights, Sergei Lavrov recently said that the European Court of Human Rights rulings around Alexei Navalny are interference in Russian internal affairs, right? That's this operation of this principle of non-interference from the perspective of the Kremlin. So sourcing these norms in the Constitution bolsters the Kremlin's foreign policy around non-enforcement of the European Court of Human Rights decisions and other international decisions, and emboldens its approach to multipolarity and building up this appearance of Russian influence and power and relativism. And here, I want to just point to the Kremlin's recent election campaign at the UN Human Rights Council, because its platform for election to this human rights body is antithetical to human rights, right? It calls for prioritizing non-interference, and it calls for prioritizing national, cultural, and historical specificities and values, right? That's a debate over relativism, and it's a debate that was put to rest in the 1990s through the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, and it was also put to rest by the OSCE's Human Dimension, right? Which plainly provides that states can't invoke non-interference as a basis for shrugging off concern for human rights within their own domestic contexts. So that plank, right, is now being asserted and played out at the UN Human Rights Council. And in addition to that, the Kremlin has situated this opposition to attempts to falsify history, which I'll speak to in a moment, and also protection against the insult of religious feelings, which ties back to a long-standing debate over claims of defamation of religion and prioritizing the right to protect religious beliefs over freedom of expression. So where does the church fit in to this manifestation of sovereignty and non-interference and multipolarity? Well, the church is in lockstep with the government here on sovereignty, on non-interference, and Patriarch Kirill's quote really says it all. In fact, orthodoxy can be a leg up in building out this multipolar world the Kremlin is advocating. So in addition to this kind of long-standing echoing of invocations of sovereignty and multipolarity and non-interference, I would submit that the most telling evidence of the church echoing Kremlin foreign policy is when the church steps away from the principles of non-interference and the principles of sovereignty, because those are the same times that the Kremlin does it. And here, there are a couple of examples that I can point to, but we can consider the recent events in Montenegro surrounding the 2019 law on freedom of religion or belief that was controversial, particularly around the fate of property belonging to the Serbian Orthodox Church. So presumably that would be a matter of domestic politics, but for the Kremlin, it was viewed actually as something that went beyond national boundaries because it tied to this issue, as the Kremlin put it, of unity and cohesion of the Orthodox world. So invoking orthodoxy was a means of breaching this sacred principle of non-interference. And the church was on the same talking points, right? And really interestingly, the church takes a much more geopolitical approach to the justification for non-interference, right? Because in their view, the Montenegrin authorities at the time were tilting towards Western Europe and Euro integration, in the words of the church. And that was the basis for interference in Montenegrin domestic affairs to prevent the undercutting of the Serbian Orthodox Church and the boosting up of a potentially autocephalous church in Montenegro. I think we can also look to Syria in this context as well. Plainly, Russia vociferously opposed humanitarian intervention in Syria through the UN Security Council, even in the face of President Assad's use of chemical weapons against his own civilian population. And the church was silent. They had issued a statement on growing manifestations of Christianophobia in the world. And even in that statement, in recognizing that Christian minorities were vulnerable and were being persecuted, they urged that they did not want to interfere in internal affairs of the state and called on the world community not to do it either. But in 2015, when the Kremlin dramatically did an about-face and began its own intervention in Syria, the church got in line and even at one point was urging other states to join a holy war and putting forward the Kremlin as the protector of Christian minorities abroad. And I think that the church's deafening silence in the face of civilian deaths due to the Russian military's operations in Syria most revealingly betrays the extent of its backing for the Kremlin view of sovereignty and multipolarity and non-interference. So we can turn to falsification as the second amendment that I wanted to look at today. And this relates to the legacy of the Soviet Union in World War II and its efforts to fight against Nazi fascism and bring about an end to World War II. And the Constitution now formally prohibits denigration of this record or questioning of it. The bubble that I have up here from President Putin is quite plain, right? That the conversation around the legacy of World War II and the role of the Soviet Union and some of its activities outside of defeating Nazism are viewed as a threat to the fundamental principles of the world order that will inevitably lead to a harsh payback. I would submit that this campaign against falsification, right, against this triumphalist narrative that the Kremlin is holding out, this sacred story, if you will, around Russian power and triumph, has significant foreign policy implications, right? And to illustrate those, I would only point to a recent report that was issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a long 300-page report on human rights situation in selected countries. And it speaks at length about this war waged against historical truth. And it sets up those that are waging this war against historical truth as Nazis and fascists and brown shirts. And this war against historical truth is driven by racism and xenophobia and manifested through attacks against traditional values by those who propagate ultra-liberal values, and also functions to aggravate the human rights situation of Russian-speaking minorities living outside of Russia. So this historical narrative of the untouchability of Russia's World War II record is central to the Kremlin's narrative of Russia on the international arena and on the international stepping field. So it's manifested in war, the war on monuments, the so-called war on monuments. The photo I have here in the background that you can't really see so much anymore relates to the Konev memorial in Prague that was removed. And in the face of the removal of that statue, Moscow prosecutors reportedly launched an investigation into Prague officials for public desecration of symbols of Russian military glory. I don't know how that will work extraterritorially, but it was reported in the media. So where is the church on falsification? Well, the church here too is in lockstep with the Kremlin, jealously guarding this historical truth and this narrative, and not accepting, in fact, rejecting any questioning of the legacy of the Soviet record during World War II. In one meeting with the president of Bulgaria, Patriarch Kirill went on a 6-minute long attack, deeming the president's remarks outrages of historical revisionism. And it's important to point out here that in this framework, the Patriarchate is actually able to operate without some of the diplomatic fetters and diplomatic niceties that Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has to cling to. And you can see this reproduced elsewhere in Estonia and in other places. And I would submit that while the constitutional amendment on falsification is tied to Russia's historical record, the shared narratives, right, the false shared narratives that the Kremlin and the Moscow Patriarchate are sharing, right, are in joint attestation to, if you will, right, aren't limited to war memory. We can look at it and see it in Russia's record, internal record, domestic record on freedom of religion or belief. Sergei Lavrov goes around saying that Russia has accumulated great experiences in ensuring coexistence of peoples and various creeds and protecting what he calls true religious values. Metropolitan Hilarion, who's the head of the church's external affairs department, says in Russia there were no religious wars or religious confrontations in its history. People in our country have been able to find a language of mutual understanding despite differences. And those narratives fly in the face of not only Russia's historical record, underwriting the protocols of the elders of Zion and disseminating it, forcibly transferring Crimean Tatars from their homes, and the current day campaign against Jehovah's Witnesses and other religious groups that have been deemed non-traditional. Ukrainian autocephaly is another place where we see accusations of falsification being leveled against the ecumenical patriarchate. with Sergei Lavrov going so far as to say that the rejection of that tomos that was issued to the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church was intended to prevent the rewriting of history and the spread of a Nazi virus. The same can be said for the annexation of Crimea. The photo that we have up right now is the new, consecrated in 2020, Cathedral of the Russian Armed Forces. And the Russian Orthodox Church had planned a mosaic that included a depiction of President Putin alongside people celebrating the March 2014 bloodless joining of Crimea to Russia. President Putin decided that it was too much too soon, and the church relented, and that mosaic hasn't taken its place at the church. But nevertheless, the story that's being told around Crimea from the perspective of the church and the Kremlin is the same story. The third amendment that I want to turn to relates to compatriots, and obviously compatriots are a matter for external affairs and for foreign relations because the compatriots are living overseas or outside of Russia. And compatriots have had a place within the constitutional framework in Russia, but the amendments now place this kind of added responsibility on the government to ensure that compatriots are able to exercise their rights, their interests, and the preservation of Russian national cultural identity. That's outside of Russia. And for President Putin, the compatriots play this really important role, right? They've long been recognized as a strategic national priority for projecting Russian power, this idea of a Russian world, Russian influence, Russian civilization. And compatriots have also manifested in Russia's foreign policy concept as well as a linchpin for reinforcing a range of foreign policy priorities. One of the challenges with compatriots is that the definition under law is elastic and unclear. And one of the chief organizations that I want to draw our attention to, because they relate to some of the church's work on this front, is the Federal Agency for Compatriots Abroad. This organization has offices in 80 states, and it's really the chief agent for protecting compatriot interests. It oversees a web of quasi-state and government-organized NGOs abroad, including the International Council of Russian Compatriots and the Russian Orthodox Church's NGO, the World Russian People's Council. And the activities that are undertaken by this web or network of NGOs are far-ranging, but all intended to advocate on behalf of Russian interests and undertake that advocacy at some degree of arm's length from the Kremlin. The issue of compatriots is also really important because of its tie back to the issue of passportization that was witnessed in Georgia, South Ossetia, where the Kremlin issues passports to Russian compatriots abroad and then uses the presence of Russian nationals as a basis for intervention. The elasticity of the definition of compatriots makes this a bit unpredictable, as it were, but already in Donbass, we've seen over 200,000 residents being issued with Russian passports. So the question is, to what degree is that going to serve as a basis for underwriting Russian intervention? And even if it doesn't underwrite actual intervention, it certainly does put a finger on the scale in the context of any negotiations that might unfold in that context. So the church, in the context of compatriots, really does play a pivotal soft power role. According to President Putin, the Russian Orthodox Church's mission knows no state borders, right? The church itself views itself as a multinational church. And it links directly to compatriots that are adherents of Russian Orthodoxy. And this global mission makes it so that the church has ready access to compatriot populations abroad. But that access goes beyond compatriots, right? It includes interreligious and governmental engagement as well. And here we can see the church at work, right? I already talked about the Church of All Saints in Strasbourg, but the church has been actively, vigorously, in fact, expanding its footprint abroad in Europe and Southeast Asia. The Russian Orthodox Church's relatively new spiritual and cultural center that's a stone's throw from the Tour Eiffel and was built at a cost of $100 million of government funding, now benefits from diplomatic immunity because the Russian embassy has designated it as the church where its officials and employees worship. That church is undertaking the same function as the church in Strasbourg, right? Strategic situation, showcasing an outsized influence and impact of Russian civilization. The formal cooperation with the Agency for Compatriots is another way that the church is actively on the front lines of generating support from compatriots and organizing and networking compatriots. And the third point here that I want to focus on is the NGO that the church runs called the World Russian People's Council. That body has consultative status at the United Nations and has viewed its mandate as being far beyond the narrow confines of compatriot-based interests, right? So for example, the World Russian People's Council has at the United Nations undertaken activities in opposition to sexual orientation and gender identity rights, and has undertaken activities relating to supporting Russian so-called humanitarian diplomacy in Syria. And that begs the question, as it were, about the definition of compatriots and to what extent that definition is elastic enough to include non-Russian Orthodox populations. To what extent is that policy open to including this subset of Christians or traditional or conservative Orthodox Christian communities that have been deemed at risk? There's already an acknowledgement that within Syria, Russia's involvement is at least being posited as a clear defense of common culture and a defense of these persecuted Christian communities that have been in existence within Syria for so long. All right, and the final amendments that I want to relate today go to traditional values. And here there are three in the context of the constitutional amendment process. The first is that Russia's declared secular constitution now makes an express reference to God, now includes an express prohibition on same-sex marriage, and also includes a catch-all requirement that government policies strengthen traditional family values. I want to just briefly pause here and say that plainly, all of these amendments have significant ramifications for domestic politics and domestic life in Russia, but I'm focusing on the foreign policy implications. And here, it's crucial to understand that traditional values is a core plank in the way that Russia is putting itself forward on the international stage for international leadership in this multipolar environment, right? And so for the Kremlin, traditional values is being framed as the way to protect people from the West. And Sergei Naryshkin goes even more clearly, as it were, right? Because he says that promoting LGBTQ rights, spreading feminism, dilutes family values. And if family values are diluted, then societies can be manipulated, and that leads to so-called colored revolutions, right? So the power struggle that's being played out, the acute sense of concern that the Kremlin feels for the loss of its traditional spheres of influence, its traditional spheres of territorial influence, because of Western liberalism, right? The way to push back against that encroachment is through this formula of traditional values. And here, right, because the Constitution has enshrined these traditional values, it's virtually impossible to say that the Russian Orthodox Church won't play an enlarged and enhanced role in advocating for these values, right? I mean, the church has been advocating for them for longer than the Kremlin. And for the church, this is nothing less than a battle between militant secularism and the ultra-liberal West, and the need to unite, create this global alliance of traditional religious confessions with Russia at the point of leadership. The campaign for traditional values relates to the redoubled effort to undercut universal human rights and to undercut human rights mechanisms like the European Court of Human Rights. It pushes back against the extension and the provision of non-discrimination and equality rights to vulnerable populations, including those on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And it really serves to build out this network of actors under the banner of traditional values, with Russia at the spearhead. And so the photo here is Metropolitan Hilarion meeting with former Vice President Pence and Franklin Graham at a 2017 conference in defense of persecuted Christians in Washington, D.C. This is one of the ways that the church exercises its soft power at the behest or in the interest of Kremlin foreign policy. The church goes around, and I'll give several examples, and then I think I'm going to wrap up, all right? First, direct appeals to individuals, compatriots and non-compatriots abroad. So for example, the Patriarch traveled to Bulgaria and then urged Bulgarians to reject the European Union for imposing what he called behaviors believed to be sinful by Christians and ethically unnatural. Appeals go to other religious groups. So for example, in 2016, the Pope and the Patriarch agreed to the Havana Declaration. And the text of that declaration is an endorsement of the need to protect Christians. But at the same time, that document tacitly validates Russian policy in Syria, tamps down any criticism of Donbass or Crimea, critiques the West, and positions the Kremlin and the church as natural peacemakers. The summit here from 2017 is another example of that soft power effort, right? A joint statement with Franklin Graham that was released stressing the importance of Russia and the United States working together to combat terrorism and protect Christians, urging Christians worldwide to pray for the important meeting between President Trump, former President Trump, and President Putin. Setting aside all of the other urgent and pressing international law and human rights issues to position the protection of Christians at the expense of everything else, including Kremlin foreign policy. The activity of the church has also been called a part of an unholy alliance directed at reverting feminist and sexual human rights gains on the international level, restricting freedom of expression and minority rights, the regional and international levels, because of the work and the lockstep efforts at the United Nations and elsewhere with other traditional values-oriented states and organizations like the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The biggest point here, I think, that needs to be underscored is that however tacit the message is, the church equates successful defense of traditional values with bolstering the Kremlin's foreign policy and undercutting the West. At the end of the day, the Russian Orthodox Church's plea for Christian alliance and unity to defend Christians at risk is premised on accepting Russian leadership and the defense of Kremlin foreign policy. I think I will turn to this last slide and then be happy to turn to discussion and questions. Patriarch Kirill recently said that the church has basically never had the same status that it enjoys today as an equal partner. It's always been subordinate, and today it enjoys an equal dialogue and common goals. I would submit that this perceived equality is coming at a cost, and that communicating to its 100 million plus Orthodox faithful across its interfaith outreach efforts and through its global diplomatic engagement, that Russian influence and projection of power comes first. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, Rob. Thank you so much for such an engaging and rich discussion. Questions have been pouring in, and we will do our best to get through as many of them as we can. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to dive straight in.
Sure.
This first one comes from Angela, who asks, what are the long-term pros and cons of the church, of the Russian Orthodox Church, working on the same foreign policy agendas as the Russian leadership, such as this emphasis on multipolarity? You mentioned also, Rob, towards the end of your remarks, the ways in which this partnership often operates as a kind of form of counter-feminist activism. And Angela was also interested to hear more about, more specifically perhaps, how this kind of religious soft power affects the status and security of women around the world?
Okay, that's a lot of questions in one shot. So let me take the second one first, because frankly, it's the only one that I remember right now. There's two things that I would point to in the context of Kremlin advocacy, relativism, undercutting of existing international human rights norms. The first was a campaign that dates back quite a while now to have what was called traditional values inform human rights. And plainly, number one, obviously the concept of traditional values is elastic, but was being used as kind of a rallying cry to have conservative, traditional religious values inform the substance of international human rights. That effort ultimately was rejected by the United Nations human rights institutions. And the reality is that it ties back to this claim that Moscow continues to make, right? That national, cultural, religious, traditional values come first when we're framing what human rights are. And that is not the case. That cannot be the case, right? If we go back to the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, there is a global understanding that national, cultural, local realities can't be used as an excuse to restrict or impinge on human rights. But that pressure is still coming. Right. And so the second prong of attack, if you will, was and is still this effort to put family values first and to have family values inform the substance of international human rights. That becomes a problem for a lot of the reasons that I think I'll be able to get into here with respect to rights of vulnerable groups, domestic violence, right? Even in Russia, there was an ongoing effort to have domestic violence ignored, right? Because there was a concern about breaking up the traditional family or having husbands be hauled off to jail at the expense of the family. And so the push at the United Nations around family values was again about having individual human rights be on the second rung to the protection of family values. That effort also generated a lot of support, right? Russia, all of the OIC states aligned in favor. So really narrow, closely battled debates over the language of resolutions about what role the family and family rights ought to take. So I hope that that's touching a little bit on that second part. And if you want to give me a little aide-memoire, I'm happy to take the first.
Sure. So the first one, as I take it, is to kind of start by saying, okay, so there's this very close symbiotic relationship between the Kremlin and the ROC at present. But what longer term, what are the circumstances or conditions under which that relationship might sour?
Okay, would sour. So, I mean, in the first instance, I think the way I tried to end this presentation is that there's a lot at risk here, right? I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church has a long, rich legacy. But it also suffers from a legacy of co-option during the communist era that was harmful to the church. And if the church is ready to go all in, as it were, with Kremlin foreign policy in the name of promulgating traditional values and having a larger, more muscular, more respected standing for Russia on the international level, it's going to come at the expense of things like civilian deaths that go uncriticized in Syria. And how long the church itself is going to be able to kind of maintain that position is another question. Obviously, there are debates within the church's internal structures, and I'm really focusing on kind of the final policies that are emerging at this highest level.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So only 16 more questions to go now.
I'll be here all night. Don't forget to try the veal.
Great. So the next question comes from William, who asks about the impact of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church being granted autocephalous status and the impact of that on the Russian Orthodox Church and Putin's policies in the remainder of the Eastern Orthodox Church.
Yeah, so this is great. I mean, I alluded a little bit to this in talking about Montenegro and these kind of traditional spheres of influence, and autocephaly remains probably the biggest thorn in the side of the Russian Orthodox Church today. And they are vociferously fighting against it, unfolding in other places, right? They call it this Ukraine scenario. So it's a blow to the church. It's a blow to the prestige of Moscow and the Kremlin. And I think it's going to be an ongoing issue. And I think we're seeing it again. I mean, I was alluding to it in the context of Montenegro as well, so that even the Orthodox churches that are aligned with the Moscow Patriarchate, right, blows to their prestige, blows to their status, are blows, subsequent blows, right, to Moscow as well.
Great, thanks. Next question comes from the Berkeley Center's director, Sean Casey, who asks, to what extent is the Russian Orthodox Church funding US-based religious groups such as the National Prayer Breakfast, Samaritan's Purse, the World Congress of Families, or international religious freedom organizations?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I am not going to know the front side of that because that's going to be outside of my purview, but I can say that in the context of generating the type of soft power that I've been talking about today, the IOM, the International Organization of the Family, and also the other organization that Sean mentioned, right? Those are groups that are pointing to Russia as the leader, right? The protector of persecuted Christians, right? That have been trying to get the US government on side with respect to this alliance to protect Christians abroad. And, you know, it's interesting, and the name of this convention eludes me, but towards the end of the Trump administration, they had signed on to a very conservative declaration around human rights that was undercutting of women's rights and others. And one of those groups actually said, hey, it's our lobbying efforts that kind of led to this, right? And so if you want to try to find that kind of line and draw those connections between the influence of Russian soft power through the Orthodox Church to domestic religious organizations in the United States, and then back up to the US government, those groups themselves are making those connections.
Okay. Next question comes from a Professor Trigg, who asks, if Russia is so concerned about external interference and quote unquote human rights, why is it so anxious to be part of the Council of Europe with its sponsorship of the European Court of Human Rights?
So that's a fantastic question as well, right? We have to remember that there's been a sea change in government in Russia, right? And the time that Russia, post-communism, right, in the immediate aftermath of the fall of communism, was joining up to these international and regional institutions, right? And viewed membership in the COE and ratification of the European Convention on Human Rights as necessary steps, if you will, to kind of join or rejoin the international community. That's no longer the case, right? Right now, we have a situation where Russia has, for a long time, right, even before the constitutional amendments, created a legal framework for rejecting the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. Okay, that is in and of itself an action that undercuts the stability of the institution, right? So what's happening in those institutions now, right? And we have to ask the question: is that effort, is that policy directed and intended to undercut the legitimacy of the organization, the progress that those institutions and organizations have made in the course of their 50, 60-year histories, right? And, you know, it's interesting because even within the Council of Europe, it's not just rejection of European Court of Human Rights decisions. It's rejection of policies that are coming out through the COE's arms relating to discrimination, right? So Russia has vociferously protested against any kind of scrutiny of sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination in the country that's being undertaken by the COE, right? That too is kind of weighing down on the organization and the ability of it to kind of pursue its mandate of enforcing human rights. So it's a point of concern for sure. And let me just add, right, that the Russian Orthodox Church's representation to the COE is right there operating in lockstep to kind of reiterate and support those Kremlin decisions.
Okay, great. Next question comes from John Dan Folani, who asks whether in your work you are aware of or note any presence or impact of this phenomenon on the continent of Africa?
So Africa hasn't been a place where I've studied or spent a lot of energy, but I can say that money is going to Africa. Development assistance is going to Africa through Russia. And part of the offensive that Russia is undertaking in that regard, in handing out or doling out this international funding, provides an opportunity to use traditional values as a platform for engagement and building up those ties. So Russia has done it in the context of Ethiopia. It's done it in the context of other more traditional societies, even where there isn't an Orthodox Church in place. So it's not limited to Europe, right? And the Russian Orthodox Church is building churches in these far-flung places, right? It's not only about the near abroad or the European continent, it's about Southeast Asia, about Africa, and other places, right? South America as well.
Okay, great. Really interesting question here now from Sarah Riccardi-Swartz that has some resonances with Sean Casey's earlier question about the implications of this for the United States. Sarah says, thanks for your excellent presentation. I'm curious how this elastic definition of compatriots might be utilized by the Church to protect and defend converts to Russian Orthodoxy, either the MP or ROCOR, in the United States, who consider themselves Russian Orthodox and hold to far-right ideologies that align with Putin's traditional values rhetoric. Could the concept of compatriots be weaponized to extract these believers from the quote-unquote secular US and or to help the Russian state challenge the US?
Yeah, so that's another big question. So far, I'd like to think that it's not at that point, but on the elasticity of the definition of compatriots, I know I didn't elaborate on this idea very much, but the potential, right, is there for the definition to kind of enlarge itself to encompass not only individuals that have a connection to Russia or ties to Russia, but a connection to Orthodoxy, right? One example of that was even in Syria, there was an instance of a hierarch of the church there saying, protect us, give us Russian citizenship, right? 20,000 people, give us citizenship. So the challenge with that is that, you know, when we link it to this idea of passportization, and when we then link it to the basis for intervention, right? Russian nationals are at risk, right? This Russian minority that holds Russian passports are at risk. We're going to use that as a green light for intervention. And even if it doesn't come to that, right, it has an impact on the nature of the negotiations between Russia and whatever state it is that is now home to that large population of Russian nationals that have been passportized. So I think it's important to recognize the activities that the church is undertaking, right, as part of its religious mission that bleed over into this very political context, right? And there's already been efforts at this within the European Union. There was an attempt to legislate, actually, and invoke the name of the church in that context, right, of the Russian Orthodox Church, to make the connection not only between conventional sources of misinformation and disinformation that are being subsidized by Russia, but actually naming the Russian Orthodox Church as one of those institutions. And the name of the church was actually taken out of the final version of the legislation that I'm talking about, and instead it went with language surrounding problematic social and religious groups, right? So there definitely needs to be an awareness of the activities that the church is undertaking and how they tie back to bringing people on board for what the Kremlin is advocating for foreign policy, right? So, hey, let's say protecting Christians, that sounds really good. That sounds really important. Okay, all you need to do to get that to happen is accept Russian leadership in this area and ignore everything else that's unfolding that might be unpalatable.
Okay, great. In the interest of efficiency, I'm going to start combining a couple of questions now that sort of touch on similar themes. And here's two that in various ways kind of are asking about where the ecumenical patriarchate fits in all of this. So Elias Damianakis asks, invites you to expand your perspective on the ROC and Putin undermining the ecumenical patriarchate and Russia's relationship with Turkey. I'm going to combine that with Jerry Panghurst's question, who's asking, within Eastern Orthodoxy, are there any effective paths of resistance and articulators of resistance to the ROC dominance and place in foreign affairs of Russia, besides Bartholomew, who acts against the ROC, and Kirill in Eastern Orthodoxy? Who is effective in doing this? Is a religious rationale employed in resisting the ROC internationally?
Yeah, so that's also a great set of questions. Let me say this. The willingness to link the ecumenical patriarchate to Nazism and fascism, right, and falsification speaks volumes to the extent that really speaks volumes to the extent to which the Kremlin views autocephaly in Ukraine as a severe blow to its status and its prestige. And that is ongoing, as I mentioned, right? That has not gone away. And I think that if there is one proverbial thorn in the side of the Moscow Patriarchate, it remains to this day, that decision, right? And so there's a constant effort to continue to undercut the legitimacy of autocephaly in Ukraine. And I think there's a constant worry that kind of Nazi virus, right? The denial of the historical narrative that the church and the Kremlin are putting forward, right? When that's at risk, remember, right, non-intervention falls to the wayside. Assertions of the importance of sovereignty and respect for sovereignty in the international order fall to the wayside because orthodoxy, right, is increasingly the glue that Russia is using for its national identity, right? Even though it's a multi-faith-based society.
Okay, thanks. And I want to acknowledge that Ralph Nelakava had also asked a question about the Patriarch Bartholomew. I want to move now to a question from Sarah Wilton, who asks if you're able to contrast the role of the Russian Orthodox Church and that of the Roman Catholic Church vis-a-vis the influence on family values, gender identity, and consistency with Western foreign policy.
Yeah, I haven't. That's a terrific question. Right now, candidly, I'm sitting on a manuscript of over 100 pages that I need to get out that's really just dedicated to these constitutional amendments and the implications for foreign policy and the role of the Russian Orthodox Church. But this is a vexing issue, right? Because again, the currency and the language of traditional values is appealing to a lot of religious groups, right? But from my perspective as an international human rights lawyer and someone who's concerned with the operation and the protection of international human rights, when we engage around this question, it necessarily is going to be coming at a cost to the protection of even basic principles like non-discrimination and equality for vulnerable groups. And here, again, if we go back to the discussion around family values, what happens to a young person who's struggling with a sexual identity within a family when family values is the overriding concern rather than that individual's right to be free and live in equality and dignity.
I'm going to turn now to a question from Jason Morton of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, who says, domestically, the Russian Orthodox Church uses the promotion of traditional religion and values to restrict the rights of religious minorities under the pretext of fighting cults and extremism. Is there a foreign policy dimension to this? Is the Russian Orthodox Church involved in soft power countering violent extremism efforts abroad, for example?
Yeah, that's an interesting question also. So obviously I have intentionally and purposefully set aside the domestic context of all of these constitutional amendments because we just don't have enough time to get into them. And obviously it would be outside of the geopolitics of religious soft power that we're talking about today. But plainly in Russia, there is an ongoing campaign to brand so-called non-traditional religious groups as extremist and proceed to outlaw them, their individual members, their practice, and frankly, the right to freedom of religion or belief in that context. Internationally, I have not seen that kind of effort or that kind of organized campaign. That's not to say that it isn't out there in more nuanced ways, but I haven't seen it.
Okay. Let me move on now to a question from Luis Felipe Diaz Pereira, who asks, to what extent can Russian religious soft power influence European integration, considering the relationship between secularism and the Orthodox churches in countries such as Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania?
Yeah. So this is, again, a terrific question to contemplate. I would submit, right, that the Russian Orthodox Church, at least on the continent of Europe, has for a long time been creating this clash of civilizations, right? And it's a clash between secular, ultra-liberal, godless West and traditional values. The degree to which these other Orthodox churches are aligning themselves with that very kind of strong message that's coming out of the Moscow Patriarchate varies. And that power, right, the way the church wields it is done in a way that is open to undercutting European integration, right? Sending a message directly to Bulgarians that they need to oppose the European Union, right, is a message that undercuts European integration, right? And that's a message that is being consistently communicated wherever the Patriarchate travels. And to be clear, right, the church conducts a foreign policy of sorts, right? The church is engaged all over the world in meetings with high-level government officials, right? We saw a meeting between Metropolitan Hilarion and the Vice President Pence in the slideshow that I presented. And the church is engaged in meetings with ambassadors that are stationed in Moscow as well, right? So there is this ongoing discussion, but alongside that, there is this direct outreach to compatriot populations and non-compatriot Orthodox believers, other religious believers, and that message tends to argue or tends to signal that European policies are liberal policies and are harmful to traditional values, the values for which we stand.
Okay, great, thank you. And Rob, I realize you're a legal scholar and your work on this topic has a very narrow focus.
It is narrow, but I mean, all of this is super on point and super relevant. And I'm trying to kind of suggest that, you know, I am certainly in this vein of kind of the legal ramifications or potential legal ramifications of the constitutional amendments on the foreign policy efforts within this international arena. Yeah.
Are there for those joining us today who may be interested in more of a conventional comparative politics or international relations analysis of this phenomenon, are there any particular books that you would recommend? This is actually a question that Jeremy Chen in our audience had posed earlier on.
You know, I do have to say that there is a wealth of, even a burgeoning wealth of scholarship around this question that is taking place in a variety of academic disciplines. So I would be kind of loath to pick out one at this point, but I'd be happy to kind of compile something. But, you know, the sources in my policy brief and obviously the sources in the book chapter will be coming out, will be flagging a lot of that scholarship as well.
Okay, thanks. Let's see if we can squeeze at least one more in. This comes from Yaroslav Skira, who asks what you might know about the extent or size of the Russian Orthodox Church social media and sort of outreach and propagation mechanisms, particularly with respect to the sort of Russian civilization discourse.
Yeah, I'm not on social media. so
you're probably better off for it.
Right. And so it's not something that I am looking at very closely, but I will say that as far as the website goes, lots of information there. You know, one point that I didn't get to make in the presentation is that at one point, church officials were saying that the COVID pandemic was actually going to support multipolarity. I wasn't sure how, it wasn't really explained in detail, but they were certainly on message for multipolarity, even in the face of this global pandemic that we've been grappling with. So I can't speak to the social media disinformation, but I think that I brought at least 4 examples of these narratives, right, that are in common with the Kremlin, that the Moscow Patriarchate is consistently advocating, that can be framed as misinformation or disinformation.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we are at the top of the hour. I apologize to those of you whose questions weren't answered today. We will make sure that Professor Blitt sees all the questions that were posed. I want to first and foremost thank him for his remarks and for obviously prompting such a rich, wide-ranging discussion. This, huge engagement from our audience today on this topic, Rob. My thanks also to Ruth Gopin, who coordinates all of our events here at the Berkeley Center, and all the rest of the center staff for making these sessions possible. And finally, let me thank you for joining us today. Those of you in the audience, take care, stay well, and hope to see you at another of our events soon.
It's been my sincere pleasure. Thank you, Peter.